Welcome to this full sewing tutorial for the Maeve dress, a relaxed throw on and go style that's as comfy as it is charming. We're sewing the Mrs. version in this video, and there's even a matching version for the littles if you want to sew one up for a child too. I'm using a light cotton for mine, perfect for warm days and easy movement. Maeve features generous ease, so there's no need for zippers or buttons. Just slip it on and go. You can add bust darts for a more structured fit, and the bias-bound neckline ties into a sweet little bow. With 2 sleeve lengths and a vintage length skirt with a full ruffle, Maeve is a joy to sew and wear. Let's get started. Here are the wrong side of my front bodice pieces, and I've marked my darts. Now I'm going to pin them in place. Now I'll sew the darts from the outside edge to the point, leaving thread tail so I can tie them in knots. Once the darts are sewn, I'll press them toward their respective side seams. Place the front and back bodice pieces right sides together and align the shoulder seams. Pin in place. Sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, then I'm going to finish the raw edges together and press them toward the back bodice piece. Place the front bodice pieces right sides together along the center front. I'm going to draw myself a 1 inch seam allowance from the bottom to where the material begins to taper toward the neckline. I'll pin this section in place, then sew right on top of my stitching line. From the bottom, back stitching at the top of my line. I've gone ahead and pressed that seam allowance open, as well as pressing that 1 inch seam allowance approaching the neckline. Tuck the raw edges underneath to meet the seam line. Doing that on both sides and giving it a good press. Now I'm going to edge stitch along the fold, pivoting at the top to sew straight across at the bottom of the V. Then I'll edge stitch back down the other side. Then, starting our stitching from those outer corners on either side of the bottom of the V, we're going to edge stitch the remainder of this seam toward the neckline on both sides. At the bottom of the V, you may have a small pucker in your fabric which will not be visible from the outside of the garment. Using a pin, I'm going to mark the center of my bias tape. And I'm also going to mark the center of my back neckline. Now I'll place the right side of my bias tape onto the wrong side of my bodice fabric along the neckline, starting at the center back. I'm going to pin in place along the neckline so that the crease in my bias tape is 3/8 of an inch away from the raw edge of the neckline. Now I'll sew the bias tape in place from center front all the way around to the opposite center front with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, which should be right in line with the crease of the bias tape. Now I'll turn my bodice right side out. I'm going to fold the opposite edge of the bias tape over the seam that we just created, with the opposite folded edge of the bias tape still folded in place, so that the new fold sits right on top of the seam line and the seam allowance is concealed. Pin in place. Now that the neckline bias tape is pinned in place for the ties that extend beyond the neckline, I'm going to open up the bias tape along the short edge and fold that short raw edge to the wrong side by about 1/2 inch. Then refold the bias tape along its original pressed lines. This will create a clean finish at the end of the bias tape and pin in place. Then with the bias tape of those ties folded along all of their crease lines, pin in place all the way up to the neckline. Repeat on both sides of the neckline. Now we can edge stitch along the open edges of the bias tape all the way from the bottom of both ties to the neckline, then continue to edge stitch along the outside folded edge all the way around the neckline. To prepare for gathering the top of the sleeve, we're going to sew basting stitches from outer notch all the way across to outer notch, leaving thread tails on both sides so you have threads to pull for gathering. Here are my front and back bodice pieces opened out flat along the shoulder seams. And we're going to start pinning our sleeve in place along the arm side. We're going to pin from the underarm seam to the front and back notches on both sides. Once we have those outer sections pinned, we can start gathering the top of the sleeve. Align the notch at the top of the sleeve with the shoulder seam and pin in place. Also distribute your gathers to fit evenly in this middle section and pin in place. Sew the sleeve in place from one outer edge of the sleeve all the way across the top to the opposite outer edge with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, then finish your raw edges together. Along the bottom of the sleeve, fold that raw edge to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch, then once more by an additional 3/8 of an inch all the way across. Now that we have those two folds in place, edge stitch close to the upper inner fold all the way across to create a casing. I've cut my 1/4 inch elastic to the length for my size listed in the pattern instructions. Now I'll secure one short end of the elastic and begin drawing it through the casing. Once the opposite short end of the elastic meets the raw edge at the bottom of the sleeve, I'm going to baste that section in place within the seam allowance. Then I can continue drawing the elastic to the opposite side and secure the short end on the opposite edge. Fold the sleeve in half right sides together, aligning the short edges. And we're going to pin from the bottom of the bodice across the sleeve seam to the bottom of the sleeve. So with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges together and press them toward the back bodice. Repeat to create and attach both sleeves. Place the front and back top tier pieces right sides together and pin the side seams. Sew both side seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, finish the raw edges together and press them toward the back skirt. Along the top raw edge of the skirt, we're going to sew basting stitches all the way around within the seam allowance so that we can pull those threads and gather the skirt to fit the bodice. Now I'll pull my gathering stitches so that the skirt fits the front and back bodice pieces, aligning the side seams. Right sides together. Then pin all the way around, evenly distributing the gathers. Now I can sew my first tier to the bodice all the way around with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, then finish the raw edges together. Place the bottom tier pieces right sides together and pin the side seams. Sew and finish the side seams in the same way as we did for the top tier pieces. Here is the bottom edge of my bottom tier piece. To create the hem, we're going to fold that bottom raw edge to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch, then once more by 1 inch all the way around. Now that both of those creases are pressed in place all the way around, I'm going to edge stitch close to the upper inner fold all the way around to complete the hem. I've gone ahead and sewn basting stitches all along the top edges of the bottom tier. Now I'm ready to pull those basting stitches to gather the front and back bottom tier. Now that that's gathered, I'll place my bottom tier right sides together with the top tier and distribute the gathers evenly to fit all the way around, aligning the side seams. Now that my bottom and top tiers are attached, I'm going to sew all the way around with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges together exactly as we did to attach the top tier to the bodice. And now the dress is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.